ሆርን ሪቪው የተሰኘው መጽሔት ኢትዮጵያ በ1993 ዓ.ም ለኤርትራ የሰጠችውን የሉዓላዊ ሀገርነት ዕውቅና እንደገና እንድትመረምርና እንድትነጥቅ የሚጠይቅ ጠንካራ ክርክር ያቀረበበትን ሰፊ ትንታኔ አውጥቷል።
መሰልናን ህላዌና ናጽነትናን በቃልስና ጥራይ ዘይኮነ በሕጋው መንገዲ ብናይ ህዝብ ኤርትራ ሙሉ ተሳታፍነት ዝመጸንበር በቡራኬ ወይ ድማ በቅዳስ በብዙኾነ ይኹን ለግሲ ናይ ዝኾነ ኃይሊ ከምዘይ መጸ ደጊም ካነቶም ባህልቱ ምርግጋጽ ሕማቅ ይመስለኒ
No one was invited to offer Eritrea independence in a silver platter, not at all. We rejected that all the way. We waited for 2 years after 1991, 1993, a referendum, fair and free choice of the population was expressed through that referendum. We got our independence. No one gave us our independence. We did not get our independence from anyone, not Ethiopia, not Somalia, not Sudan, or even the international community.
ህዝብ ኤርትራማ ደቁ ኸፊሉ ተቃሊሱ ንመንግስት ኢትዮጵያ ደሲቁ የውጽዋ ኮሙ ገራ ይሓራ ዝወፀት ኤርትራ እምበር ብትኳዎ ብሰናይ ድሌት ናይ TPLF ሰናይ ድሌት ናይ መለስ ዜናዊ ሰናይ ድሌት ናይ ሽዑ ነበርና ሰግር መንግስት ነበርና አይኮነን
Eritrea's Red Sea sovereignty, an irrevocable reality. An Addis Ababa-based outlet calling itself the Horn Review, styling itself an independent research platform, has published a reckless piece titled, Eritrea Unraveled, the case for Ethiopia's reversal of state recognition. Few notions are more absurd than the idea that Ethiopia could somehow undo Eritrea's sovereignty. Yet that is precisely the fantasy Horn Review peddles. Draped in policy jargon, the article is propaganda masquerading as scholarship, hollow revisionism dressed up as analysis. The essay pretends to advise the Ethiopian government on the prudence of revoking recognition, weighing supposed legal, strategic, and normative factors. But its foundation collapses on inspection. Strip away the borrowed language, and what remains is a cheap echo of the Prosperity Party's daily hallucinations, empty rhetoric from the Prime Minister's podium to the General's saber-rattling. Hollow, repetitive, and fabricated, it is noise mistaken for logic, volume confused with substance. Eritrea's independence was never Ethiopia's to grant, nor is it contingent on Addis Ababa's recognition. Eritrea's statehood is rooted in decolonization, secured in blood and sacrifice, confirmed by international law, and reinforced by 3 decades of sovereign practice. To deny this is not analysis but fiction. The 6 young faces paraded as the Horn Review team, a little more than props, mouthpieces laundering regime talking points under the guise of research. Their voices are ventriloquized by a desperate leadership searching for intellectual fig leaves to cover its naked revisionism. The essay itself is a patchwork of half-truths, irrelevant tangents, and contradictions, an incessant harangue that mistakes noise for argument. The shame is not simply that the argument is weak but that it is illegitimate. No serious scholar of law or history, and no layperson with even a basic grasp of international relations, could endorse it. The idea that Ethiopia, a state drowning in famine, displacement, and civil war, could revoke the sovereignty of a UN member is laughable. Worse, by toying with this fantasy, Addis Ababa only exposes itself to a harsher reckoning, reparations for 30 years of illegal annexation and plunder, damages for wars it waged and lost, and international condemnation for its relentless destabilization. This is not an academic exercise. Should Ethiopia persist in questioning Eritrea's sovereignty, it will invite counterclaims of staggering proportion, rooted in 3 decades of occupation and destruction. In doing so, Addis Ababa shows not strength but desperation, a government chasing mirages while sinking in quicksand. History is unambiguous. The military defeat of Ethiopia in Eritrea. Eritrea's independence was not conferred in 1993. It was carved out on the battlefield after 3 decades of unrelenting war. The Eritrean People's Liberation Front, EPLF, lightly armed and perpetually outnumbered, faced down a Soviet-backed Ethiopian military machine and broke it piece by piece until it collapsed entirely. The turning point came at Nakfa, the fortress town where Ethiopia's repeated offensives were repelled year after year, forging both Eritrea's military doctrine and national identity. From Nakfa the tide rolled outward, Afabat, where Ethiopian lines shattered in a rout, and then Massawa, the jewel of the Red Sea. In February 1990, Massawa was liberated in an operation of audacity and precision. The Ethiopian navy was annihilated, and 18,000 soldiers were killed in the city's defense. When Addis Ababa launched its counteroffensive to retake the port, another 30,000 Ethiopian troops fell in futile waves. Ethiopian army logs reveal the scale of the desperation: 5,000 artillery and rocket rounds fired daily, supplemented by over 10,000 mortar shells. The Gindi front endured the storm and held. The failure broke the back of Ethiopia's war effort and marked the beginning of the end. The end came swiftly. Between May 19 and May 24, 1991, Eritrean forces launched their final offensive. The Ethiopian army in Eritrea was shattered. Dikeme, Asmara, Mendefera, and Keren fell in rapid succession. On May 25, Assab was liberated, cutting Ethiopia's last link to the sea. The rout was complete. On the southern Red Sea arena, what remained of its once formidable forces had been driven southward in disorganized flight, hoping to regroup around the port of Assab. Yet here too, the tide was unstoppable. The EPLF, moving swiftly, pressed its advance with unbroken momentum. The garrison at Assab, cut off from reinforcement and already demoralized by the catastrophic defeats in the interior, attempted to mount a stand but quickly collapsed under combined ground assaults and relentless artillery strikes. The port, Ethiopia's last foothold on the Red Sea, fell on May 25 with stunning finality. Foreign occupation that started in Assab in 1869, ended there in May 1991. The scale of the Ethiopian collapse was total. Out of 130,000 troops deployed in Eritrea, more than 114,000 had been taken prisoner, 80,000 on the retreat towards Barka on the way to Sudan, 21,000 at Kisidika on the border with Ethiopia, and 13,000 in the vicinity of Asmara. Another 16,000 were killed in action. The garrison at Assab fared no better. Most were captured, a few stragglers fled by sea to Djibouti or Yemen, and the rest were cut down in the rout. The material losses were staggering. Except for 3 tanks and a few vehicles that slipped across the border into Sudan, the entirety of Ethiopia's arsenal in Eritrea was seized by the EPLF: 200 tanks, 50 130mm guns, 177 122mm artillery pieces, 44 BM-21 rocket launchers, 18 BM-24s, over 100 anti-aircraft guns, and more than 1,000 mortars. Thus ended Ethiopia's 3-decade occupation of Eritrea, not by negotiation, not by phased withdrawal, but by the utter destruction of its army in the field. It was an unconditional defeat, absolute and irreversible. The figures tell the story with brutal clarity: tens of thousands killed, over 100,000 prisoners marched into captivity, and the entirety of Ethiopia's arsenal, tanks, artillery, rocket launchers, mortars, captured intact. The once vaunted army of the Derg, Black Africa's largest and most heavily armed force, ceased to exist as a fighting entity. With its collapse, Eritrea's independence was no longer a matter of aspiration but a fact etched in fire and blood. The fall of Assab, Ethiopia's last outpost on the Red Sea, closed the chapter with finality. Eritrea had reclaimed its coastline, secured its sovereignty, and consigned Ethiopia's maritime presence to history. What remained of Ethiopia's might was not power but memory, a shattered force, broken beyond repair, leaving behind only the ruins of its ambition. Eritrea's right to statehood, decolonization denied, justice delayed. Eritrea's right to statehood stemmed directly from the principle of decolonization. By every standard of international law, Eritrea should have been freed in the early 1940s after Italy's defeat, or at the very latest in 1952 when British administration ended. That it was not is a stain on the conscience of the UN system. It happened only because Western powers colluded to sacrifice Eritrea's right in order to secure the geopolitical interests in the Horn. The UN's 1960 Declaration on the Granting of Independence to Colonial Countries and Peoples affirmed that all peoples had the right to self-determination and that colonialism must be brought to a speedy and unconditional end. Eritrea's demand for independence was not an exception, it was a textbook case of decolonization denied. The cost of that denial was staggering: 3 decades of war, tens of thousands of lives lost, hundreds of thousands injured, villages burned, industries dismantled, and livelihoods destroyed. Unlike Namibia or Zimbabwe, which eventually secured independence through internationally brokered processes, Eritrea was forced to win its freedom entirely through blood and sacrifice. The 1993 referendum was not legally required. It was a voluntary step the EPLF and Eritreans chose to show the world what they had already secured in fact. Ethiopia's recognition was nothing more than reluctant acknowledgement of this reality. Montevideo's mirror, Eritrea meets the test, Ethiopia shatters it. The Horn Review dares to claim that Eritrea has failed to mature into a viable state. Anyone with a grasp of arithmetic can see the absurdity. If Eritrea's 30 years of independence are deemed failure, what of Ethiopia's claim of 3,000 years of independence? Has Ethiopia, 100 times older, managed viability? Has Ethiopia consistently fed its people? No. It has endured famine after famine, from wallow in 1973-75 to the catastrophic 1983-85 famine that killed nearly 500,000. Has it secured effective control over its own territory? No. Its federal system is collapsing, with regions in perpetual revolt. Can its citizens travel freely from Addis Ababa to Bishoftu, Fish, Ambo, or Debre Birhan, within 50 miles away? No. The roads are unsafe, hostage-taking is rampant, and certain ethnic groups are barred from moving to the country's capital. Can Ethiopia survive without the billions in foreign aid, budgetary subsidies, and NGO handouts it begs for each year? No. It is a state on life support. That is not viability. It is dependency masquerading as permanence. Since 1975, millions of Ethiopians of varying statuses have fled abroad. That staggering figure makes Ethiopia one of Africa's largest exporters of people, rivaling countries locked in prolonged civil wars. This is a nation that loudly boasts of 3,000 years of independence yet hemorrhages its population decade after decade. The irony cuts deeper still. Thousands of Ethiopians have sought asylum in the West under stolen Eritrean identities, turning false identity into a routine escape hatch. By some estimates, more than 40% of those who entered Europe claiming to be Eritreans were in fact Ethiopians. In the United States and Canada, the percentage is even higher. Under the TPLF regime, this fraud was not incidental but systematic. Relatives of the leadership were shipped abroad on stolen Eritrean identities, exploiting a credibility Eritrea had earned in blood. By contrast, Eritrea, so often caricatured as isolated, has stood its ground, retaining both its people and its identity even under extraordinary pressure. The scandal grows darker still when one recalls that senior Ethiopian officials themselves openly admitted that Eritreans, who had money or relatives abroad, were lured Ethiopian officials who were in the human trafficking and human smuggling racket. And in this sordid business, the UNHCR was not a bystander but a willing partner, lending its imprimatur to a racket that robbed Eritreans of their name while laundering Ethiopians into the West. If migration patterns themselves are a litmus test of viability, Ethiopia fails that test spectacularly. International law reinforces this reality. Recognition does not create sovereignty. It records it. Once a people satisfy the Montevideo Convention's 4 criteria, territory, permanent population, effective government, and capacity for foreign relations, their sovereignty is not hostage to a neighbor's whim. Eritrea's admission to the United Nations in 1993 sealed this reality beyond dispute. Comparisons to Taiwan or East Germany are irrelevant. Eritrea is neither a contested entity nor a consensual merger. It is a recognized UN member and a permanent fact in Africa's legal and political landscape. The 1964 OAU Cairo Declaration freezing colonial borders was crafted to prevent precisely the sort of irredentist revisionism Ethiopia now flirts with. Addis Ababa cannot invoke that principle to protect its borders with Kenya, Sudan, and Somalia, then discard it when the target is Eritrea's lawful coastline. By every measure, Eritrea satisfies Montevideo's test. Its permanent population, drawn from highlands, lowlands, and islands, remains bound by a cohesive national identity forged through struggle. Its territory, rooted in colonial treaties, has been reaffirmed by international arbitration, most notably the Eritrea-Ethiopia Boundary Commission under the binding Algiers Agreement. It has an effective government that maintains nationwide control, provides free education and health care, and ensures stability, led by officials whose modest lifestyle and anti-corruption ethos set them apart in a region riddled with graft. Eritrea also demonstrates full diplomatic capacity, engaging the UN, and a host of bilateral partners. Here lies the contrast that Ethiopia cannot escape. A state's viability is not measured by grandiose claims of antiquity but by its capacity to govern, to keep its people, and to project stability. Eritrea has done so under siege conditions. Ethiopia, despite its donor billions and self-proclaimed millennia, has failed to feed its own people, failed to hold its borders without conflict, and failed to keep its citizens from fleeing en masse. If Montevideo is the yardstick, Eritrea clears it with clarity, while Ethiopia stumbles over every criterion in practice. Eritrea, a beacon of stability and civility. Amid the so-called arc of crisis, Eritrea stands apart. Its 1,000-kilometer Red Sea coastline has served as a firewall against extremism and a strategic anchor for regional security. 30 years ago, the late U.S. Secretary of State Warren Christopher described Eritrea as an unlikely oasis of peace and civility, a beacon of hope astride the Horn of Africa. Those words remain true today. What distinguishes Eritrea is not the absence of challenges but the way it confronts them. Its leaders reject the patronage and corruption that hollow out neighboring states. Unlike Ethiopia, where billions in aid vanish into war and cronyism, Eritrea has remained disciplined, investing in universal education, healthcare, and security. Leaders live modestly, not in palaces. The priority has always been sovereignty, peace, and national cohesion. Ethiopia, by contrast, has unraveled. More than 4.5 million Ethiopians are displaced, figures comparable to Afghanistan. Famines continue to scar its history. Even in 2024, Ethiopia was one of the world's largest recipients of food aid, with the UN appealing for $3 billion to feed over 15 million people. The ledger of exploitation and war. If Ethiopia insists on questioning Eritrea's sovereignty, it must first confront the record of annexation and economic plunder that defined its 30-year occupation. Between 1962 and 1991, Eritrea was not simply administered, it was stripped of its resources, wealth, and autonomy. The ports of Massawa and Assab, once among the most efficient on the Red Sea, generated millions in customs and transit fees. In the 1970s, Assab handled nearly 3.5 to 4 million tons of throughput annually, revenues that were absorbed into Ethiopia's central treasury in Addis Ababa rather than reinvested locally. Studies from the period show that Eritrea's ports effectively subsidized Ethiopia's foreign trade for decades, with transit fees, shipping duties, and fuel depots channeling steady income to Addis while Eritrea itself remained underdeveloped. Alongside the ports stood Kagnu Station in Asmara, one of the United States' most important Cold War listening posts. Declassified U.S. records indicate that Washington paid tens of millions of dollars annually for its lease and local operations, money that was routed through Ethiopia's accounts, even though the base sat on Eritrean soil. By conservative estimates, Ethiopia collected between $40 million and $60 million a year in the late 1960s and 1970s from Kagnu, funds that propped up its budget and military expansion. None of these revenues were recognized as belonging to Eritrea. Eritrea's factories and industries, which by the mid-20th century included textile plants, breweries, and one of East Africa's few automotive assembly lines, were systematically dismantled. Machinery was relocated to Ethiopia, depriving Eritrea of its industrial base. The short-lived Nippon Mining's copper operation at Dabawa provided another case in point. From the 1970s onward, extraction revenues enriched Ethiopia's coffers while leaving Eritrea environmentally scarred and economically bereft. Financial theft compounded this structural plunder. During Ethiopia's occupation and for 6 years after liberation, the Ethiopian birr was Eritrea's sole legal tender. Eritrean workers were paid in birr, trade was conducted in birr, and Eritrean savings were stored in birr accounts. In November 1997, Eritrea introduced its own currency, the Nakfa, and the Bank Eritrea exchanged the birr which was circulating by Nakfa. This meant the Bank of Eritrea held vast balances of Ethiopian currency, representing the cumulative value of goods and services extracted under occupation. The International Monetary Fund, which mediated before the introduction of the Nakfa, explicitly acknowledged these balances as Eritrea's asset and Ethiopia's liability. At Ethiopia's request, the World Bank was approached to mediate, but when it signaled readiness, Addis withdrew its delegation, blocking any resolution. To this day, the birr balances remain in Eritrean vaults, unreconciled and unpaid. A silent but enduring record of a debt Addis refuses to honor. Even worse, in the final days of 1991, as the EPLF advanced on Asmara, Ethiopian authorities drained Eritrean citizens' private deposits from Ethiopian commercial banks. Ordinary families who had entrusted their life savings to banks in Asmara, Keren, and Mendefera found their money seized and transferred south, never to be returned. This act of mass expropriation remains an unresolved private and collective debt, an open wound compounding the state-level liability. To these economic and financial crimes must be added the devastation of war. The Ethiopian army waged campaigns of deliberate destruction, aerial bombardments of towns, the burning of villages, and the use of napalm and cluster munitions. After the liberation of Massawa in 1990, Ethiopian aerial bombardment reduced the historic port to rubble. Human losses were staggering. The 30-year tally is mind-boggling. Tens of thousands killed and scores of thousands maimed, entire communities uprooted and forced into exile. International precedent provides a clear yardstick. After Iraq's 1990-91 occupation of Kuwait, the United Nations Compensation Commission compelled Baghdad to pay over $50 billion in reparations for economic damages, oil theft, and civilian suffering. By the same principle, Ethiopia's occupation of Eritrea, marked by siphoned port revenues, diverted foreign base rents, looted industries, seized bank deposits, and war crimes, justifies Eritrea's claim for reparations. Conservative calculations place the combined damages, economic plunder, financial theft, and wartime destruction, in the tens of billions of US dollars. Adjusted for inflation and lost opportunity costs, claims could easily scores of billions in today's values. The conclusion is inescapable: Eritrea's sovereignty is not up for debate, but Ethiopia's debts most certainly are. What Addis owes Eritrea is not a favor of recognition but a reckoning for decades of exploitation, theft, and war. Final word. This is the sword of Damocles hanging over the Prosperity Party's neck. If the current government of Ethiopia insists on reopening the settled question of Eritrea's sovereignty, then Eritrea has every right to reopen the ledger of 1952-1991. That reckoning would not be rhetorical. It would be legal, financial, and devastating to Ethiopia's already fragile standing. The record is clear. For 30 years Ethiopia siphoned off Eritrea's port revenues, collected millions in US base rents from Kagnu Station, looted factories, dismantled industries, extracted minerals, and imposed a monetary regime whose accumulated balances remain a recognized debt by the IMF. It stripped ordinary Eritreans of their private bank deposits in the final days before liberation. It waged war with napalm and cluster munitions, raised Massawa under a daily barrage of thousands of shells, and left behind scorched earth and mass graves. By any international precedent, from Iraq's reparations to Kuwait to Namibia's claims against South Africa, Eritrea's case is ironclad. The damages, conservatively measured, run into tens of billions. Adjusted for inflation and lost opportunity, the figure is far higher. Eritrea's independence is not up for barter. It is permanent, irrevocable, and beyond the reach of revisionist fantasy. It was earned in blood, secured in sacrifice, and sealed by international law. No saber-rattling, no coercion, no desperate ploys of recognition or derecognition can alter that reality. Eritrea will never bend to threats. It cannot be cowed or coerced. Its sovereignty is untouchable, its resolve unbreakable. Threats fall powerless before Eritrea's determination. No force on earth can undo what Eritreans secured through 30 years of struggle. Eritrea will stand firm, unyielding, unshaken, unmovable. Period. Full stop. By Red Sea Beacon. October 2, 2025. Legal response. The question of revoking recognition of Eritrea. 1. Introduction. The article, Eritrea Unraveled, the case for Ethiopia's reversal of state recognition, advances the position that Ethiopia could legally revoke its 1993 recognition of Eritrea, thereby reopening the question of Eritrea's sovereignty. While it is true that recognition is a discretionary act in international relations, the suggestion that Eritrea's recognition can now be reversed misunderstands both the legal nature of state recognition and the binding framework of international and regional law. The following response outlines why, under international law, UN Charter, African Union, OAU principles, and customary state practice, Ethiopia does not possess the legal authority to revoke Eritrea's recognition in the manner suggested. 2. Recognition in international law. Declaratory versus constitutive. Recognition of a state is understood in two theoretical models. Declaratory theory, dominant today, statehood arises when objective conditions, the Montevideo criteria, are met. Recognition is merely acknowledgement of an already existing fact. Constitutive theory, historically debated, statehood depends on recognition by other states. The Montevideo Convention, 1933, sets out the four criteria of statehood. 1. Permanent population. 2. Defined territory. 3. Effective government. 4. Capacity to enter into relations with other states. Eritrea fulfilled these requirements in 1993 following a United Nations supervised referendum in which 99.8% of Eritreans voted for independence. Eritrea was subsequently admitted to the United Nations on 28 May 1993, United Nations General Assembly, UNGA Resolution A, Res. 47-230. Once admitted to the UN, a state's existence becomes irreversible under international law. Thus, Ethiopia's 1993 recognition was not the source of Eritrea's statehood. It merely confirmed what had already been validated by the international community. Ethiopia today cannot unmake Eritrea's existence. 3. The UN Charter and prohibition of revoking statehood. The United Nations Charter, 1945, enshrines principles that directly preclude Ethiopia from revoking Eritrea's recognition. Article 2:1 Sovereign equality of all United Nations members. Eritrea's sovereignty is legally equal to Ethiopia's. Article 2:4 Prohibition on the use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. Attempting to revoke recognition as a prelude to territorial claims would violate this principle. Article 4. Admission of a state to UN membership is decided by the General Assembly upon the recommendation of the Security Council. Eritrea's admission in 1993 cemented its sovereignty beyond bilateral recognition. The ICJ, International Court of Justice, has consistently affirmed that once a state is admitted to the United Nations, its statehood is a matter of fact in international law, not subject to unilateral withdrawal of recognition. See Advisory Opinion on Kosovo, 2010 for relevant principles on recognition and non-recognition. 4. African Union, OAU Principles on Borders and Statehood. The Organization of African Unity, OAU, Cairo Resolution of 1964 and the African Union Constitutive Act, 2000, enshrine the principle of uti possidetis juris, respect for inherited colonial borders. This principle was adopted precisely to prevent endless border disputes and irredentist claims. Article 4(b) of the African Union Constitutive Act. The Union shall function in accordance with respect of borders existing on achievement of independence. Article 4(f) Prohibition of the use of force or threat of force among member states. Article 4(g) Non-interference in the internal affairs of member states. Eritrea's 1993 independence was recognized under this framework, with its borders defined by colonial demarcation between Italian Eritrea and Ethiopia. To suggest Ethiopia can revoke recognition now undermines the African Union's foundational legal principle and sets a dangerous precedent across Africa, where numerous secessionist movements, Somaliland, Azawad, Biafra, etc., could claim similar revisions. 5. State continuity despite dysfunction or authoritarianism. The Horn Review essay argues that Eritrea has failed under the Montevideo criteria. This interpretation is legally flawed. Effective government standard. International law does not require democratic, accountable, or efficient governance, only a central authority exercising control. North Korea, Myanmar, Libya under Gaddafi, Somalia during civil war, have continued to be recognized. Population flight. Large-scale emigration does not negate a permanent population. Even severely depopulated states, e.g., small island states, war-torn nations, retain statehood. Fragile State Index, Human Rights Record. There is no legal doctrine that strips statehood due to human rights abuses. The international community instead employs sanctions, special rapporteurs, and United Nations mechanisms, not de recognition. Thus, Eritrea's dysfunction does not meet the threshold for collapse of statehood. 6. Revocation of recognition versus severance of relations. There is no precedent in international law for a United Nations member's recognition being revoked by a former mother state. but revocation of recognition of Eritrea would have no legal effect. Eritrea would remain a UN member, retain recognition by the vast majority of states, and Ethiopia's unilateral move would isolate Addis Ababa diplomatically. 7. Historical precedents and their limits. The article cites Taiwan, East Germany, and Somaliland as precedents. These analogies are misplaced. Taiwan versus PRC. This was not revocation of recognition of a United Nations member, but recognition of Beijing as the sole representative of China under the One China policy. East-West Germany. Reunification dissolved East Germany voluntarily. Recognition was not revoked unilaterally. Somaliland 1960. Brief recognition ended by voluntary union with Somalia, not external withdrawal. In all these cases, state consent or structural change, not unilateral revocation, drove recognition shifts. Eritrea has not consented to rejoin Ethiopia nor ceased to exist. 8. Legal and strategic consequences. If Ethiopia attempted to revoke recognition, Eritrea's United Nations membership would remain intact. Ethiopia would violate United Nations Charter Article 2(4) if tied to territorial claims. It would contradict African Union Constitutive Act Articles 4(b) and 4(g), undermining Ethiopia's own credibility in regional diplomacy. It would embolden secessionist movements in Africa, destabilizing the very principle Ethiopia has long defended. 9. Conclusion. Ethiopia's aggression against Eritrea is serious and well documented. However, revoking recognition is not a lawful or viable option. Eritrea's sovereignty is entrenched by United Nations Charter principles and United Nations membership. African Union (OAU) binding rules on colonial borders. Customary international law of state continuity. Ethiopia retains the sovereign right to downgrade or sever relations, but attempting to revoke recognition would have no legal effect, would violate international obligations, and would undermine Ethiopia's credibility in the African Union and United Nations. Recognition is not a reversible concession. Eritrea exists as a state in international law, and its sovereignty cannot be undone by unilateral action from Ethiopia.
It gained its independence in 1993.
Formally. Yeah.
From Ethiopia.
Not from Ethiopia. Not from Ethiopia.
All right.
Okay.
I would like to understand.
Okay.
What it is that seems to have altered the stance of the Ethiopian government towards Eritrea.
It happened that we've been discussing this matter a few minutes ago. Number one, Eritrea did not get its independence from Ethiopia at all. We had our just cause. We fought for a long time, for almost 3 decades, probably half a century. And when 91 came, we said, we're postponing the unilateral declaration of independence to go through a legitimate political process to assure the international community and be assured that we have exercised this right through a referendum. Then people were saying, well, a referendum could be expedited if the Ethiopian government agrees to the referendum process. We said no, not at all. We are not asking for the blessing of the Ethiopian government or anybody else for that matter. We would like to exercise this right through a referendum, and we would like the international community to come help us organize and witness the desire or the wish of our population. No one was invited to offer Eritrea independence in a silver platter, not at all. We rejected that all the way. We waited for 2 years after 1991, 1993, a referendum, fair and free choice of the population was expressed through that referendum, and we got our independence. No one gave us our independence. We did not get our independence from anyone, not Ethiopia, not Somalia, not Sudan, or even the international community.
ዋና ጸሐፊ ሽዑ ዝነበረ ፍሉይ ልኡኽ ሰዲዱ እቲ መስርሕ ቃላጠፈልኩም እንትስ ምስ ኣብ አዲስ አበባ ዘሎ መንግስቲ ተሳሚዕኩም ተገበርኩሞ ደኾነ ይመሐሸን ተባሂሉ የለን ንሕና ንናጽነትና ዝኾነ ይኹን ሓይሊ ኣብዚ ዓለም ድሕሪ ኩሉ ኸ ኣብ ኢትዮጵያ ዘሎ መንግስቲ ክፍርመልና ኣይንዘልን ተሳሚዕና ከነቀላጥፎ ምሳብ አዲስ አበባ ዘሎ መንግስቲ ዓርክናን መሓዛናን ስለዝኾነ ምስኡ ተሳሚዕና ሕጂ ናጽነት ከነምጽእ ወይ ድማ ነቲ ናይ ናጽነት መስርሕ ከነቀላጥፎ ኣይንደልን ኢና ኢልና ኣብና ከምኡ እንተዘይኮይኑ ረፈረንዱም ክካየድ ኣይኽእልን እዩ ተባሂሉ ረፈረንዱም ሕቡራት ሃገራት ኣይካፈለን እንተኢሉ ናይ ዓለም ማሕበረሰብ ብዝተፈላለየ ሓይልታቱ ከም ዝሳተፎ ገርና ረፈረንዱም ከነካይድ ኢና ተባሂሉ እውን ተመጊቱሉ ይሽዑ ናይ ሽዑ ሰነዳት ሓደ ብሓደ ከም ዘረጋግፅዎ ተዘኪምናያ ዝነበርና ናይ ፖለቲካ ሓላፍነት ነዚ እዋን እዚ ነዚ ወለዶ ዝን ዘይኮነ ንመጻኢ ወለዶታት እውን ትርጉም ስለ ዘለዎ ናጽነትና ከዓ ደምና ከፊልና ተቃሊስና ዘምጻናዮ ኣብ ርእሲ ምዃኑ ኣብ ናይ መወዳእታ ሰዓቱ ብፌርማን ብቀለምን ናይ ዝኾነ ይኹን ሓይሊ ዘይኮነ ብናይ ህዝቢ ኤርትራ ድምፂ ክረጋገጽ ኣለዎ ንሕና ዝትኮብ ናጽነት ኣብ ላንካስተር ሃውስ ዝፍረም ናጽነት ወይ ብኻልእ ዝተፈላለየ መንገዲ ዝወሃበና ናጽነት ኣይንደልና ብሕጋዊ መንገዲ ዓለም ዝፈልጦ ህዝቢ ኤርትራ ኣብ ብምሉኡ ዘድምፀሉ ናጽነት ኢና እንደሊ ተባሂሉ ናጽነት መጺእ መንግስቲ ኢትዮጵያ ብቀረባ ይኹን ብርሑቕ ብጽቡቕ ድልየት ይኹን ብዝተፈላለየ መንገዲ ኣብዚ ጉዳይ እዚ ኢድ ነይርዎ ኢሉ ይዛረብ ንኻልእ ፖለቲካዊ ዕላማ እንተዘይኮይኑ ኣብ ታሪክ ዝተመርኮሰ ሓቂ ይብሉን መሰልናን ህላዌናን ናጽነትናን ብቃልስና ጥራይ ዘይኮነ ብሕጋዊ መንገዲ ብናይ ህዝቢ ኤርትራ ሙሉእ ተሳታፍነት ዝመፀ እምበር ብቡራኬ ወይ ድማ ብቅዳስ ብዝኾነ ይኹን ለግሲ ናይ ዝኾነ ሓይሊ ከምዘይመፀ ደጊምካ ነቶም ባህልቱ ምርግጋጽ ሕማቕ አይመስለኒ
የወደብ ጉዳይ ወደብን በተመለከተ ኢትዮጵያ ወደብ ከ1952 ነው ይመስለኛል ኤርትራ በተባበሩት መንግስታት ድርጅት ውሳኔ መሰረት ኤርትራ ከኢትዮጵያ ጋር በተቀላቀለች ጊዜ ነው ወደብ ያገኘችው ከዛ በፊት ወደብ አልነበራትም ምናልባት አክሱም ከዛ በፊት ወደብ አልነበራትም ኢትዮጵያ ከ52 እስከ 91 ለ40 ዓመት ጊዜ ወደብ ነበራት ማለትም የኮስታል ስቴት ሆና ውሃው ዳርቻ ያለች መንግስት ሆና ኤርትራ በፌዴሬሽን ስለተቀላቀለች አሰብና ምጽዋ የኢትዮጵያ ወደቦች ነበሩ ከዛ በኋላ ግን ጦርነት ከተደረገ በኋላ ወደቡን ኢትዮጵያ አጣች ምክንያቱም ኤርትራ ነፃ ሀገር ሆነች አሁን ይሄ
ኤርትራ ከኢትዮጵያ ጋር በነበረችበት ጊዜ እውነት ወራሪዎች አሰብ ይመጣሉ ምጽዋ ይመጣሉ ይሄዳሉ ግን መሰረታዊ የሆነ የኢትዮጵያ አካል በነበረችበት ጊዜ ወደብ አልነበራትም ለኢትዮጵያ
አልነበራትም መቼ ነው የነበራት ኢትዮጵያ
ማሳዋና አሰብ ከማን ጋር ነበር ለዘመናት
ኤርትራ ጋር ከተቀላቀለች በኋላ ካልሆነ በስተቀር ኤርትራና ከዛ በፊት የጣሊያን ነበር ከዛ በፊት የቱርክ ኦቶማን ነበር ለ400 500 ዓመት አልነበራትም የት ነው የነበራት አልነበረም ከዛ በፊት በመሐከል ባህረ ነጋሽ የሚባለው ያስተዳድር ነበር አልነበራትም ይሄንን ማወቅ ነው ያለባቸው የኢትዮጵያ ህዝቦች አልነበራትም ትግል ግን ከመዲቨል ጊዜ ጀምሮ የወደብ ባለቤት ለመሆን ወይም አክሰስ ቱ ዘ ሲ የሚለው ታሪክ አለው ራሱን የቻለ ሰፊ ታሪክ አለው ይሄንን ለማግኘት በጣም ትግል ነበራት በአፄ ኃይለ ሥላሴ ጊዜ ጅቡቲ የኛ ናት የሚል ነበር ጅቡቲ ነፃ ከመውጣቷ በፊት የኛ ናት ጅቡቲ የኛ ናት የሚል ያንን ለማግኘት ትግል ነበር የራሷ ግን አልነበራትም
በጣም ዘግናኝ አይነት አፈራረስ ነው ደግሞ ምን ፈርሰው አሁንም እየፈረስን ያለ ነው የሶማሊያ ሞዴል አይደለም የሱዳን አይደለም የዩጎዝላቪያ አይደለም እጅግ ከዛም የከፋ ነው ሶማሊያም ሱዳንም ዩጎዝላቪያ 120 ሚሊዮን ህዝብ የላቸው ሶማሊያም ሱዳንም ዩጎዝላቪያም የኢትዮጵያን ቆዳ ስፋት የላቸው ሶማሊያም ሱዳንም ዩጎዝላቪያም ሲፈርሱ አሁን ያለውን የትጥቅ መጠን የጥላቻ መጠን የመገዳደል ፈቃደኝነት አላሳዩ አይ ቴል ዩ በጣም በቅርብ ጊዜ ውስጥ አዲስ አበባ ውስጥ ብዙ መንግስታት ልናይ እንችላለን ብዙ ዋርሎርዶች ልነድ እርሱ ወለጋ ትግራይ ሐረር ጎንደር እርሱ ከጉለሌ ፒያሳ ማይትሄድበት ቀን እየመጣ ነው መታጨበጨው ደስ ብሏችሁ እንዳልሆነ ልገምት እና አሁን ሱዳን ያለው ነገር በቅርቡ ወደኛ ላይመጣ እንደሚችል ምንም እንደሚመጣ ነው እንጂ ምልክቶች የማይሳዩት እንደማይመጣ አይደለም። ስለዚህ እኔ የምናገረው ከኢምፔሪያሊስት ፐርስፔክቲቭ ነው ስል እየቃዠሁ አይደለም። የሆነውን አይኑን አይቼ ነው የምናገረው።
የሚያሳዝነኝ ነገር ቢኖር ሰላም ማጣታችን ነው።
But of course, the most lamentable thing in this is that something I regret very much, that we did not have peace.
አያቶቼ ሰላም አልነበራቸውም።
My grandparents did not know peace.
አባቴ ሰላምን አያውቅም።
My father did not know peace in this country.
እኔ ሰላምን አላውቅም።
And I don't know peace.
ምናልባት ልጄም
And who knows, my child or my children also will never experience peace in our, and I'm very sorry about that.
የአስመራ ህዝብ ድንቅ ህዝብ መሆኑን በተግባር አሳይቷል። በፍቅር ተሸንፈናል። ትናንትና ከአንዳንድ ሰዎች ጋር ስንነጋገር እኛ ኤርትራውያን በሚሳኤል በትግል አንንበረከክም አሉ። ሚሳኤል፣ ታንክ ትግል ከፈለጋችሁ 30 40 100 ዓመት እንዋጋለን። ለጋራ ኮዝ አንፈራም። ለጋራ ኮዝ መሞትም እንደ ክብር እናያለን።
እንጂ ተሐሳዊ ኣብዚ ገዛ ዝገበል ኣሎ እንድሕሪሉካ ገበል ኣሎ ዲስከር ዓና ክሳብታ ማዕፆን እተልካ ገበል የለን ካብ ትገዛ ክትክእል ኣለካ እምበር ሓሳቡ እንታይ ደይብለካ ሕጂ ኦም ወስን ከዛብ ሓታ ኣልባብ ብለካ ክሳብ ማዕፆስ ኣብ ፀሓይ ትታወኽ ክሳብ ሓሶቱ ድቃላዕ ማለት እሞ ነዳይን ተጣላዕን ሓንቲ እያ ተሓሳስቦ ቀፃሊ حدش حصلت من مهاز كا بزل فابريكات لومي حصلت كمية سجاب يلمن عرب تابلو وصل كذاب عند الباب نحساوي كساب باب أسنيو بعد هذي نحساوي أبز جزاز قبل الله دهري لوكا قبل الله ديسكر عنا حسابتا معصون أستيلكا قبل يلن كاف تجزا خطرت كلا لك أم برحساو أنت دايب لك عادي هو موصل كذاب حتى الباب لك
هاي السلاسي سرعة ودق مهان ولا زي حجز ولا سرعتين أب حنتي وان حنت معلت ودق مهان نفسه كسر حنقول قبره يقبع مجمر ودق يو من البات بنا هنا عقمي هنا وتهدراوي جزفي أنا ونشاف نقدمي تراي ديز ودق ويس كالوت رقاحيتات الله بزح رقاحيتات الله جن قدم كله نحنا رقاحيتات نفل نحنا فتحاوي ديمقراطياوي حقاوي زخنا قالس لنا إذا قالس زي بحيل خداخم يخدم بر بفلسفنا خداخم يخدم هنا ديمقراطي فتحن مثلنا يسبن كداخم على نسوق خونه إذا سخصاب زلوا متدخمنا حيلتات كله القوم جن ثورة هتأفق أي كإلين تسرعت موضوع أي ترفون إذا سل أخوانتي حساب نتوم بتهدروا في تساميتاتن مع باليتاتهم كم واناويان غيرك أخذله تسعرك من الوقت كالوقت الخونه وش تتعبي ناي عوت زمدمدمتو مسرح
الله سبحانه وتعالى كملش حيلي أكيبه 6 مليون سراويت كبير على 100 مليون سراويت كمان كبير ده 10 ولده زريهم ملش زبيل زراواتات له بزحت كاب درج وسع له حيتاتو كم عينت سنتات يسمعوا نالات نوازع كم أبنت كتكسك الخونه بأتلانتا أمانقول أخاتنا أمانقول أخات درجن أبزنا حدا زرروا أوتما أوزنا ورلو أخاتنا يدرجز وتصزنا زرواتات وأبزوات يحوم وزرلهم درجة خاب إرتراح توصناهم تقولوا فلوتي وجن تقدها وتودي ما لا تكونان تهينات كقدسليو إذا خاء بزح ترجمات فتريو إذا الرعايات نيروان بتحدى وجن زبناكم تقبلوا سبحان الله ما أكون مني ولا توصاهم منا كمان تمليشنا هنا تعبكم منا بخينا سنزغونات ملؤتم سوق إن شاء الله توزت الجد تحفش أو تحساس بان ده ثاني هم السلطان سي كتصال خينات وجوه هنا تراتر نجري ثاني هم
كم تعويت تعمل من كاتحن
حزب إرترا يهون حزب أوجنبر من الحردة دوبو تحسو كورز دلي حيلي عليو ما دوب تحسه خور يعني إرترايلو ኩናት ኣውዩ ህዝባዊ ግንባር ይኹን ህዝቢ ኤርትራ ነቲ ኣዋጅና ኩናቲ ብተመሳሳሊ መንገዲ ክምልሸሉ ይኽእል እዚ እንታይ ማለት እዩ ስርዓት ደርግኹም ዋላ ካልእ ንዕኡ ዝትካእ ሓይሊ ንስኻትኩም መሬትኩም ምስ ተቆጣጠርኩም ኣብ ቀጻሊ ኩናት ኣለና ንስኻትኩም ልሕር ዝብል ኮይኑ እቲ ኩናት ካብዚ ዘለዎ ደረጃ ናብ ካልእ ክሰግር ስለ ዝኾነ ኣብ መንጎ ኤርትራን ኢትዮጵያን ዘይኮነ ድማ ኣብ መንጎ ህዝቢ ኤርትራን ቃልሱን እዚ ስርዓትን ስለ ዝኸውን
ጀርመንን እስራኤልን ድሕሪ ግናይ መዋእል ንሽሕ ዓመት ክራዳድኡ ይግብኦምን ብናይ ፖለቲካ ጊንጥነት ግን ክልቲኦም ኣስጋኣት ስጋብ ዝበሃሉ ደረጃ በፂሖምስ ዓለም ከናቁቱ ውዕሉ ኩናት ናቱ ባህርን ሕግን ይዘሎ ከም ተሓውን ተተቆጻጺርካዮ መብሰል ምግብኻ ዝኸውን እንተ ተቆጻጺርካ ግን ምሕረሪኻ ዝኸውን ማለት ማይ እንተ ተቆጻጺርካዮ መስተይኻ ይኸውን እንተ ተቆጻጺርካ ክጸራርገካን ውሕጅ ኮይኑ ክገላብጠካን ክእል ማለት ኣብ ዘመነ AI ኢና ዘለና ንሕና ብተራኣይ ረይተሓራክም ሰባት ብምንቋት ጽልእ ብምስዋር ናብሮኦም ዝመርሑ ክንጠማዘዝ ንውዕል መሓዮ ይኮናን ማሓዮታት ናይ ማንም ናይ በሻሻ ሽሞኛ ኣጀንዳ ክህቡና ሕልሚ ክኸውን ኣለዎ ድሕር ደጊም ኖ ሞራሽ ከዕላል ያይ ንዓና ን20 ኪሎሜትር ባድማ 10 ዓመት ተዋጋእናላ ሃገርሲ 1200 ኪሎሜትር ባሕሪ ኣልዋንጣ ክነውርሮ ኢሉ ዝሓስብ ድማ ኣብዲ
ናይ ካልኦት ህዝብታት ብዙሕ ትፈልጥ ትኽእል ትኸውን ግን መን ከምዚ ህዝቢ ክንዲዚ ዝኣክል ተፃብኦ ተፃዊሩ ፀኒዑ ዶ ምበለ በና መንገዲ 30 ዓመታት ኢልካ ተዛረብ ቀሊል ነገር ኣይኮነን ሓደ ብሓደ ቶም ተፃብኦታት ዘርዚርካ ተትሪኦም እሞ ተፈቲነ ተቢዐ ክብል ይኽእል እየ ንኻልእ እንተድፍተን ከንታይ ምኾነ ካልኦት ዝተፈተኑ ዝተፈራኸሹን ፋሕፋሕ ዝበሉን ኣብ ደየድሊ ቅብሎባት ኣትዮም ዘለዉ ከምዚ ሕጂ ህዝቢ ደው ኢሉሉ ዘሎ ክኸውን ኣይክእልን ሓቂ ትደልየ ረኸበን ኣብቲ ደልየ በፅሐን ዓይነት ህይወቱ ክቕይር መነባብሩ ቁጠብኡ ክሕይል ዝነበሮ ባህጊ ዓቕሙ እውን ናይ ምስራሕ ደረት የብሉን ኣይተጠቕመሉን ክሰርሕ ኣይከኣለን ንገዛእ እርሱ ፀኒዑ ብደረጃ እዚ ክበፅሕ ምኽኣሉ ግን ቀሊል ነገር ኣይኮነን
ኤርትራ በጣም ትልቅ ሀገር ነች በኢትዮጵያ ፖለቲካ ውስጥ ደግሞ እኔ ብዙ ጊዜ ተናግሬያለሁ አሁን ብናገረው ደስ ይለኛል ትልቅ ኢምፓክት ያላት ሀገር ነች እና 5 እና 6 መሪዎች እድሜ መቀጠልና ማጠር ላይ የኤርትራ እጅ አለበት እና የኤርትራና የኢትዮጵያ ፖለቲካ እንደዚህ የተሳሰረ ነው
ህዝብ ኤርትራማ ደቁ ኸፊሉ ተቃሊሱ ንመንግስት ኢትዮጵያ ደሲቁ የውጽዋ ኮሙ ገራ ይሓራ ዝወፀት ኤርትራ እምበር ብትኳዎ ብሰናይ ድልየት ናይ TPLF ሰናይ ድልየት ናይ መለስ ዜናዊ ሰናይ ድልየት ናይ ሽዑ ዝነበርና ስግር መንግስቲ ዝነበርና ኣይኮነን ካሊ ዝለዓል ሕቶም እንታንታ ፖርት ተባሂላ ዲያታ ዓሰብናትና እያ ግዛም ዛዕ ዝበሃል ኣበይ ዘሎ ዓሰብናትና ኣበያና ሕጊ ኣበያና ውዕል የለን ኣይነበረን ዓሶን ናትና ኣይነበረን እምበር ኤርትራ ወስኡ ይለይርእ ቅድሚ ሕዚ እውን ከምዚ ስዕሮም ኣብኢዎም እዩ ካልኣይ ክድገሙ እንተደልዮም ክደግሞም እዩ ሳልሳይ ራብዓይ እውን ክደግሞም እዩ
በዛ ስእሊ እዚኣ ንጀምር እንታይ ይገብሩ ኣለዉ ትፈልጡ ዶ ينقصوا يمزلوا أبصري وشينوس ينقصوا والله اليوم سراويت شعبي هاي بالو انتاي قبرتي يلون زحتك إذا سألي بغطتها نبرهانو جل أعبي لكم سردوا لي مزيوم يخا كتسافق النخاد ما بلو اقرم قدهم ود بشاشا بشنخ عفر تنكتات هتصقعو سلست خفلات سراويت فدرال بسامرنا بإرتراغ نعن بوم حجر شد الشخفلات سراويت آتيو أبي أحمد ني إرترا درونك سد اللايو منقستي إرترا ختت أوجو كينات كجمريو زف
أتنا عين هبين ناين داماتنا خا عين دلل
وقبضة وراد بكذا بفتحن حياته حديثة وما ليش نقد نقص شعندي نحمة تنحن حياتها حيزة وعمالي حقوتها لطيزة شرع ديان حموتها كماي كماي سلام كوزي 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 هاي قبل ما تنحيتها حيسة يوعمل حموتها نقصيصة شعن ديان حموتها نقصيصة صوتها على بعد فنان إصاد قمرة بعد أولي ورقة وزباديرة نقيل له زوجها صبرة قبر كاين كتو صبيرة
share like subscribe مقبرة يترسعوا thank you